Hello everyone, my name is Wes Cavan and today we're going to explore the greater oceanic region, which includes the countries of Australia, New Zealand, and Indonesia. Now if you're wondering where these countries are in relation to the United States, if you were to go all the way across the Pacific Ocean, southeast of Asia, you'll find Indonesia, and then you'll find Australia and New Zealand. Take a look at some of the population distribution in Indonesia. You can see that it's very spread out throughout the island of Java here in the southern part, one of the most densely populated places on Earth. Take a look at Australia, and you can see that most of the population is along the perimeter of the continent, but most of the continent there is known as the outback, a very sparse population of Australia there. We take a look at New Zealand. It's broken into two islands. Most of the people in New Zealand live in the top portion of the island. 3/4, in fact, live on the top northernmost island. There are some folks in the southern islands, but most in the northern part. Take a look at country comparisons here. We talked about that population distribution in Indonesia. They're actually ranked 4th in the entire world with 262 million people living there. The United States, all told, has 329 million. New Zealand, a much smaller population, but you can see population in Australia, 23 million. The big thing to note there, I think, is that the United States is roughly on 3 million square miles, whereas in Indonesia, they only operate in 700,000 square miles, a much smaller place to have that many people. You can see that Australia, even with their population of 23 million, they're using about the same amount of land as the United States with a much smaller population than the United States. So that's part all due to the outback there. Take a look at their exports and their imports. Iron ore, coal, briquettes are two of the big ones. In New Zealand, concentrated milk and sheep and goat meat are their top 2 exports. You can see they're ranked 57 in New Zealand. The United States is number 3 in top exports. Australia and Indonesia 20 and 25. On imports, you can see their top imports there. On almost everybody, it's either cars and refined petroleum or refined petroleum and crude petroleum. The United States number 1 in imports, Indonesia number 29, and Australia is number 22. I want to take a look at the account balances. You can see as recently as 2018, Indonesia with a significant trade surplus over the United States, almost $15 billion. The exact opposite in Australia, where they have a trade deficit of almost $15 billion. New Zealand and the United States stay pretty close. New Zealand currently has about $127 million surplus there. As we examine the income distribution in the region, you can see that the highest 10% of earners in Indonesia make up the majority of the country. Their annual household income, though, very low, $3,500 on average in U.S. measurement. The income is distributed a little bit more evenly in Australia and New Zealand. And their annual household income is also much higher. So we take a look at the total economy. You can see that Indonesia is ranked 7th in the world in GDP with $3.25 trillion. Australia not far behind, the world ranked 19, $1.248 trillion GDP. New Zealand's out of the top 50 on GDP overall, but their GDP per capita puts them in the top 50 at $39,000, ranked 48. World rank for Australia in GDP per capita, they're ranked 29th in the world with 50,400. But you can see that's where Indonesia takes a big hit. GDP per capita is ranked 127 in the world with $12,400. Some interesting stats there. Take a look at their gross national product, and you see Indonesia's gross national product is very high. They are actually the largest economy in Southeast Asia, and that's something to think about when you're marketing to the oceanic region. In Australia, thing to think about is a lot of high-income families. The barriers are very few. And in New Zealand, their GDP per capita is ranked top 50 in the world. Let's dig into the culture of the oceanic region. You can see there are over 700 languages in Indonesia. Indonesian is the primary language, though there are many regional dialects, as you can see, distributed throughout the country there. In Australia and in New Zealand, English is going to be the primary language spoken there. There's no official language in Australia, but English is definitely the most common. New Zealand, the Maori language is the de jure official, but English is the de facto official there. We take a look at religious practices. You can see in Indonesia, Muslim faith is very important to them. In New Zealand and in Australia, you can see that some form of Christianity, be it Roman Catholic or Protestant, that's going to be your most practiced religion there. As we examine some business practices, you can see Indonesia is going to be the most different from the other countries. Women should dress conservatively from ankle to neck in business meetings. But the big thing here is business is personal in Indonesia. You can see that they want to build strong relationships. You may not even do any business in your initial meetings. It may all just be about getting to know you. In Australia, Aussies often use colorful language that would be unthinkable in other countries. I think that's the most unique thing about them. You can imagine sitting in an American meeting, if someone were to drop an F-bomb or something on you, it might throw you for a loop there. New Zealand cultural practices in business, very similar to the United States. They are somewhat reserved in New Zealand, but they do respect people who are honest, direct, sense of humor. Take your time in doing business with them, but maybe not as much as in Indonesia. I thought it'd be interesting to look at the Halstead Cultural Insights as a comparison to each of these countries. You can see the disparity between them. New Zealand and Australia very similar. Indonesia big on power. New Zealand, Australia big on individualism. Kind of similar throughout the others. You can tell that Indonesia is thinking about the long term though, while Indonesia and New Zealand, they're looking to party right now and live life to the fullest. I just thought that would be an interesting kind of look at the cultural distance between the three countries. To move into politics, you can see in Australia, the big thing is that the citizens are searching for stability. They've had 5 different prime ministers in 10 years. A little bit of instability there. In Indonesia, President Joko Widodo firmly believes that politics and religion shouldn't mix, but his constituents are putting pressure on him to prioritize Muslim and Islam faith over other religions and make it part of his politics. And New Zealand was one of the most stable democracies in the entire world. 4 of the last 5 governments in New Zealand have each lasted 9 years. As we take a look at tariff rates, Indonesia is definitely going to have the most barriers in the oceanic region for the United States. Average tariff rate 6.9, but it's going to change with goods and local competition. You see electronics, tea, coffee, wine, cosmetics, they're going to have an average 37% bound tariff. Automobiles and iron and steel, they're going to have a tariff rate of either greater than 40%, in some cases even unbound. Agriculture, you're going to see 1,300 products with at least a 40% tariff binding. Fresh potatoes are going to have a 50% tariff binding. Thing you got to keep in mind with Indonesia is they've got high tariff rates, unexpected changes. That leads to uncertainty in foreign markets. Under the Asian Free Trade Agreement, however, duties for those countries are going to be 0 to 5%. So within the oceanic region, Australia and New Zealand are going to get favorable tariffs, but with the United States, not so much. I want to briefly discuss currency exchange rates. You can see the United States dollar is slightly stronger than the Australian dollar. With $1 US, you can get $1.40 over in Australia. The big disparity in exchange currency in the oceanic region is going to be with the Indonesian rupiah. 1 United States dollar can get you 14,125 rupiah. In New Zealand, about 1 United States dollar is going to get you about $1.52 in New Zealand money. You can see the brief historical exchange rates in the United States. It doesn't fluctuate too much with Australia and New Zealand. The United States is typically a little bit stronger, but from 95 to 2019, you see the Indonesia rupiah. With the exception of 2010, it has just climbed astronomically. So what's that got to do with the price of eggs in Oceania? Well, a lower foreign currency rate means more for United States dollar. So say you go buy a dozen eggs in the United States, it's going to cost you about $3. In Indonesia, it only costs you about $1.32. When you're thinking about massive spending, that's something that marketers must consider when their price strategies for long-term relationships is just the disparity between those currencies. It's going to be a much different conversation in Indonesia than it is in Australia and New Zealand. As we examine the infrastructure here, the thing I want to take a look at the most is the presence of unpaved runways at the airports in Indonesia and New Zealand. They do have some airports with paved runways, but the unpaved ones could be an indication that those are not as stable airports that you would fly into for business. So that limits a little bit, but they're still there. The roadways, as you can see here in Australia, big portion of their roadways are Australian non-urban. That's going to be through the outback. As we've talked about, most of the population is on the perimeter. So if you're strategic there, you can just fly into those cities and should be okay. Indonesia, there is a large presence of unpaved roadways. Could be an indication of the infrastructure not being quite up to par there. Marketing and Research Society in Australia, advertising firms, you got plenty to help you there. Retail industry, you're going to have about 50% of the population that works in retail in Australia. It's a $120 billion industry there. Over in Indonesia, their largest retail sector is going to be food and groceries. It accounts for 65% of total retail sales. Their second largest is clothing and footwear. They do have advertising and marketing agencies that can help you as you're doing your research in Indonesia. In New Zealand, same thing. You do have help there with marketing and advertising, but retail sector worth $92.3 billion there. In Indonesia, online marketing is only 13% of the advertising market. TV still dominates advertising in Indonesia. In Australia, $9.5 billion spent on internet ads is expected to increase to $15 billion by 2023. New Zealand, digital advertising is 34% of their total advertising, $903 million spent there. It's most of any advertising category. So we take a look at the communication infrastructure. Main things I want to point out here are the internet users. You can see Indonesia has 132.7 million users. New Zealand and Australia, 90% of their populations roughly have access to the internet. Even with 132.7 million people, only 50% of Indonesia's population has access to the internet or uses the internet. Mobile telephone users, you see 193.4 million users in Indonesia. So what does that mean to e-commerce? Well, in Australia, $21.3 billion is spent online. Only 8% of their shopping is done online, however, though. 81% of their population shops online. You take a look at Indonesia, we talked about only 50% of their population uses the internet. Only 15% of them shop online when they're using the internet. 40% of their total shopping happens online. We talked about the fact that they love fashion and beauty, $2.5 billion spent online there. Total industry is estimated to be about $8 to $12 billion. In New Zealand, they are currently at about $4.4 billion as of 2017. They're expecting as of 2030 that it's going to be a $120 billion industry, though, expecting significant growth. You can see that only 28% of people in New Zealand shop online. About 11% of the total shopping is done online. Overall, I think Australia has the most stable infrastructure here. Indonesia, just because of their population, I think you can't discount them, but their infrastructure is probably not as stable overall as New Zealand. They've just got so many people, and contrast to that, New Zealand has a much smaller population. When we look at the current U.S. business presence in the region, you can see that there's plenty of opportunities for franchises, joint ventures, licensed operations. But I think the most interesting thing is Boeing actually has the largest base outside of the United States in Australia. But let's take a look at the market opportunities here. In Australia, they have made a major investment in the agribusiness culture to keep up with global food demand. They're also ready for a digital economy, so there's going to be plenty of opportunities for cybersecurity and R&D. With Indonesia, we talked about how only 50% of their population is utilizing the internet and mobile phones, so there's going to be plenty of telecommunication infrastructure opportunities over in Indonesia. Also, their aviation market is growing at 20% per year, so there's plenty of opportunities there. In New Zealand, I think the big things here is they've committed to building 100,000 affordable homes, so that industry is going to be massive. Road of National Significance road upgrade plans, that's going to be a 30-year project that requires machinery and technology, but also their tourism industry has seen significant boom, so there's going to be plenty of opportunities in the infrastructure there with hotels and that type of thing. So we finally get to the overall attractiveness of the Oceania region. I think it's a very attractive market overall for the United States. Clearly, the Australia-United States Free Trade Agreement is just too significant to not do a lot of business in Australia. Too similar in culture. In Indonesia, they have the largest economy in Southeast Asia, so you can't ignore that. Their population is just too big to really not do anything there, but I do feel like there are some significant cultural barriers. Also, even though they are along the most viable trade route in the Pacific Ocean, the Chinese-U.S. trade conflicts are going to play a factor there. I think it's the least desirable of the three regions in the Oceanic, but still you can't discount it. And then in New Zealand, very stable government, very similar culturally to the United States, ranked easiest in the world to do business with. So definitely an attractive market there. But I really think overall the Oceania region is going to be a great spot for the United States for years to come. And that brings us to the end here. So I want to acknowledge my references. I could not have done this project without an enormous amount of research, but I really hope you've enjoyed this exploration of the oceanic region with me, and I hope you have a great day.